You're listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming up into Tuscaloosa. A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
So we can expect at least another 2 to 4 inches overnight. Then that snow.
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Massachusetts.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
Good Thursday evening. We're joining you live here on the Weather Junkies. I'm Tyler Jankowski, joining the show from Bristol, Connecticut, alongside Dakota Smith, but he's not in Colorado. I don't know where Dakota is. Dakota?
Hey, everyone. Hey, Tyler. Yeah, I'm in Maryland, actually, north central Maryland. It's where I grew up, and just out here visiting family for the weekend. And it's some great weather. It's weird, coming from Colorado. It's humid to me, but it's by no means that humid for a Maryland day. But I really like the humidity, so it's a nice change of pace. Had some stratocumulus out there today. So overall, really nice day. How's the weather up in Connecticut?
It's gorgeous. We had an upper level low last, ugly and kind of painful. We really need rain, and we didn't get much rain at all, so it was kind of a waste. Now we've had days of sun and Major Hurricane Matthew, a big topic of this show, is a clean miss for New England. So we were initially concerned about impacts from Matthew, but now it's going to be sunny most of the time for the next week. We have a front on Saturday. That's the only exception. When we look out 7 to 10 days, it's dry. I mean, if you believe the Euro, we barely get a drop of rain next week with high pressures. So we have a drought. We've discussed it before. It looks like the drought's going to get worse in the next week.
Yeah, well, hopefully get some rain sometime soon. But tonight we're joined by very special guest Ian Livingston, who's in Washington, D.C. right now. Ian, I'm assuming the weather is pretty much the exact same for you down there.
Yeah, hey guys, thanks for having me to start. And so I love your show. I'm looking forward to chatting about Matthew and various other things. We've been sort of stuck on the line between the sunshine to the north and the clouds to the south. So today I thought was going to be sunny and it ended up cloudy. Yesterday I thought it was going to be sunny or cloudy and it ended up sunny. I think it's supposed to be cloudier the next few days as Matthew sort of gets a little bit closer and a cold front approaches. We're not quite in the drought conditions you are up there in Connecticut, but it's been pretty dry and mostly sunny here for the last couple months.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was sitting at a bar eating lunch today, and I heard someone say, they said it was going to be sunny today. It's pretty cloudy, though. And I was like, I wonder. I was about to text you and say, hey.
I think, I don't know how familiar you are with Capital Weather Gang, the blog on the Washington Post here that I'm part of, but we do a daily digit, and I know today our daily digit was 10 of 10 and it was supposed to be sunny. I think we heard a little bit about that one. It happens. Like, I think it was sunny in northern Maryland. We missed it by 20, 30 miles, but
yeah, well, it happens.
Yep.
Yeah, so the show tonight, we're going to do it a little differently. We're actually going to spend a good chunk of time on Matthew, and while doing that, we'll talk about a few tweets, and that'll take up a good chunk. But before we do the tweets, let's learn a little bit more about Ian. Ian is a senior researcher at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings. He's not, his full-time job is not in weather, but he's already left a substantial mark on the weather community. He co-founded the Eastern U.S. Weather Forums, a very, very popular area among the weather community in the 2000s. Additionally, he co-founded U.S. Tornadoes. We had Mark Ellenwood on, one of his buddies who co-founded it with him, and it's a staple to find your severe weather, ustornadoes.com. And last but not least, Ian alluded to it. He is a lead forecaster over at Capital Weather Gang, and we're glad to have him on. So Ian, first question, how did you get into meteorology? What kind of drove your passion?
That's a good question. I think like most people, I sort of came to it when I was a really little kid. Probably in a bit different way than a lot of folks. I grew up in Southern California, so we didn't really have too much weather. I think my first love sort of came with the 4 or 5 weeks of weather that we would get in the winter. my parents had a place up in the Sierra Nevada, and we would see huge snowstorms there. Honestly, I think my first love in the field was earthquakes, earth science, and it sort of just translated to weather over time. I moved to Texas and saw huge storms, and I moved to Connecticut and saw giant snowstorms. So it's just been a continual evolution, but I've pretty much been addicted throughout my whole life at this point.
How long did you live in Connecticut?
About, I think it was 8-9 years. I went to UConn, so
Nice.
I was a Connecticut staple at this point. Yeah, me and my girlfriend, we both live down here in DC. She's from Connecticut as well. My family lives up in Connecticut, so I have quite a few ties up there at this point still.
And what did you study at UConn?
Political science, focused on the Middle East, South Asia, counterterrorism, those sorts of things. It was sort of that post 9/11 period where I was one of the folks in school when that happened, and it sort of, I guess it made things click that maybe I should study that field. I've more or less followed that here into DC. I've worked in a similar sort of area throughout the whole time that I've been here.
So weather has always been a little sidecar to political science?
Yeah, I think yes and no. They're actually more similar than I think a lot of people might immediately envision, I guess. I mean, if nothing else, they're both forecasting. You could use lessons from forecasting global security into, at least on the probability end, you can move that over to weather, those sorts of things. You look at patterns from the past and try to translate them forward to what you might see in the future. It's obviously not quite the same. We don't have models. Well, I'm sure CIA and those folks have models, but we're not looking at models in the geopolitical world per se. But like I said, I think they are pretty similar.
All right, fascinating. We want to get into our Twitter segment this week, and it's heavily focused on Matthew, as it should be. Matthew, a major hurricane, still as of the 8 o'clock update, with a maximum sustained wind of 130 miles per hour. So it is slightly weaker than earlier today, but it remains a very dangerous storm, and it is on a northwest trajectory to at 13 miles per hour. So it's heading right for Florida. We've heard a ton about it on the news and on Twitter, and very hopeful that everyone has taken the necessary safety measures in advance of this storm. Dakota, do you want to lead us off on the tweets of the week?
Yeah, sure thing. Let's get into the first tweet right here. This is from Sean Breslin. You can follow him at Sean_Breslin. Awful. This tweet says, awful. Haitian government announces the death toll from Matthew has risen to 264. BBC with the report. That's pretty sad news right there. And we were talking a little off air, and Ian, you were saying, whenever something goes through there, it always causes havoc like that. So
yeah, Haiti's a tough place. Obviously, they had that huge earthquake there a couple years ago, and I think these are sort of the kind of concerns that you have in the future as population grows in developing countries, and then you just have massive natural disasters that take out hundreds or thousands of people. It's pretty scary. And I mean, the pictures out of there have been nightmarish, and I think we're just starting to see it's probably going to look a lot worse when it's done.
And part of the issue with Haiti was also that it was the northeast quadrant of the storm, so the worst of the wind and the storm surge, and you couple that with what we know about Haiti, and it just was not a good result. Unfortunately, that number continues to climb on the death toll, and as the storm approaches Florida, the warnings have been pretty dire. In fact, the Weather Channel released a video today, and it's from Brian Norcross. He is the former chief meteorologist at a southern Florida station, so he's definitely well known in parts of Florida that have a close eye on the storm. We want to listen in on that special message that the Weather Channel published just a few hours ago.
friends in Florida. Today, on behalf of the Weather Channel, I have a special message about the threat from Hurricane Matthew. This is like no storm in the record books. We are concerned about reports of people deciding to stay in areas under mandatory evacuation orders. This is a mistake. This is not hype. This is not hyperbole. And I am not kidding. I cannot overstate the danger of this storm. Central and North Florida have never been hit by a hurricane this strong. If you live in a Florida evacuation zone, you need to head for a safe spot now. Do not assume you can survive if you choose to stay. There will be overwhelming damage and likely a heartbreaking loss of life. Based on everything we know, Matthew will make history. The Weather Channel does not want you to be part of that history.
A very powerful message there from Brian Cross at the Weather Channel. For those of you that don't know much about Brian, he was a major player in the forecast of Hurricane Andrew back in the early 90s, so definitely well known in the area. And he had some very pointed words there for the threat from Matthew. So, you know, the Weather Channel has kind of struggled with coverage in the last couple of years, and this is really one of the first major storms in the social media era and in the last couple of years for the Weather Channel. So we're really seeing how they cover something like this for the first time in this modern era in the last 5 years. So interesting to watch it play out in that regard.
Yeah, I guess Hermine was kind of a pre-show for them to get.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because it had a pretty big impact, but not nearly as much as Matthew is going to have. Ian, I loved your part of your tweets today all about Charlie and how I think you wrote about Charlie and the internet and how it was one of the first big storms to happen during a different age of the internet. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know, I guess everybody watching these hurricanes, we're always trying to analog them, look for past examples that are similar. I think you heard some of that in that statement from the Weather Channel. I guess there has never really been, at least in the modern record, a hurricane that's come in on an angle like that into eastern Florida, especially this strong. But Hurricane Charlie, it happened back in 2004, and it was a strong Category 4 at landfall, similar size to Matthew at this point. It didn't have quite as long of a life, going way back into like Haiti and in the Caribbean as Matthew, but some similarities. It actually approached coming up the west coast of Florida. I know initially a lot of people were worried that it was going to hit Tampa. I think we saw some of those really scary statements out of Tampa about how skyscrapers would see their windows blasted out and all that kind of stuff. But it ended up sort of jumping into the shore a little bit earlier than forecast. These storms that sort of parallel the coast, especially once they get really close, it's really tricky to figure out just exactly where they're going to come in. And then you have the additional thing with Matthew where it might not even come in. It sort of might just scrape the whole coast, which I know is another reason why everyone's a little nervous about what it does. But I think Charlie was just it was before Facebook, it was before Twitter, it was before the modern social media, but there was already sort of a brewing social media behind the scenes. I mean, we had the weather forums back in the early 2000s. There was Usenet and like little chat groups on AOL and stuff like that in the 90s. So I think by the time you got to Charlie, you already had some capabilities to get quick video out and sort of track it in more of like a real-time sense, almost like you were immediately there. So it was sort of just like a hint at what's to come. And I know a lot of us have been sitting around saying, I wonder what the next major hurricane is going to look like in the US. Is everyone going to freak out? What's going to happen? All that kind of stuff. So from that angle, it'll be interesting to watch, even though I'm sure we'll see some scary stuff in the days ahead.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned about Matthew not landfalling in a technical sense. And we were talking earlier, and that just means that the center of the eye crosses shoreline. And it doesn't seem like it's gonna. I think it's gonna be close enough that even if it doesn't make landfall, The pretty nasty winds of the eye wall are going to impact parts of the eastern Florida coast. And then you still have the storm surge that's going to be a problem regardless of it, if it actually makes landfall or not, and then inland flooding, which is also from just rainfall, will also be an issue. So I don't think the warning of this and the precaution of this should be diminished by any sense. And it looks like there's a lot of weird kind of like conspiracy stuff. I stepped away for Twitter for a few hours this evening, and then when I got back, it was all about like how Matthew was a conspiracy, and how like I saw Matt Lanza do a whole big long thing about how, you know, that meteorologists aren't doing it for attention or for clicks. This is actually like a big deal, and it's going to impact a lot of people. So I just think we need to kind of say that, you know, it's not.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, especially as someone who's not a meteorologist, but knows a lot of meteorologists, and I think at this point has a pretty good idea of what meteorologists think, but is also some way a public person. I mean, I would at least just say to everybody out there that the conspiracy idea is just like ridiculous. Like, you don't see, in the past day or so, I think almost every meteorologist I follow is scared of a storm like this. And there's plenty that downplay the hype and don't get caught up in like making everything the next huge thing. This one, I think a lot of it is just people want to make sure they get the word out. It's tough. I think a lot of these forecasters sort of feel responsible when something bad happens, even though they try really hard. And I think we should just come at it looking at it like that.
Absolutely. Our next tweet comes from Billy Embody. He is a scout.com football type tweeter, and the reason that plays into what we're talking about is he tweeted a statement from the SEC, the vaunted Southeastern Conference, and there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not college football games would be postponed in Florida. I saw a great graphic. Someone put the time and effort into making it. It had at least a half dozen games in Florida over the next couple days, and ultimately the game in Gainesville between LSU and Florida has been postponed. I'll read the first paragraph. It says the LSU football Florida game scheduled for Saturday in Gainesville has been postponed due to Hurricane Matthew. It was announced Thursday. The universities and the SEC office will work to reschedule the game later in the 2016 season if possible. So some good news that the weather information made it into those upper offices of the SEC, and the game was postponed, because we don't often see good decisions made at sporting events. But I think Matthew's big enough that we're seeing the right decisions here.
Yeah, that could have been quite the problem if they actually didn't take that in consideration. I think it was 2 weeks ago we talked about the Oklahoma Lightning situation. Much different problem that we have here, and yeah, good thing they took the initiative there. We'll move on to our next tweet from Michael Lowry. You can follow him at Michael R. Lowry. He's the hurricane specialist over at the Weather Channel. His tweet says, "Not all tracks are created equal. For storm surge, northwest moving storms more impactful for northeast Florida, southeast Georgia. Matthew's track unprecedented." And then he's quoting a tweet by Philip Klotzbach, who we had on the show, with 14 category 4 to 5 hurricanes hitting the U.S. In the 44-year period from 1926 to 1969. And there's not really none of the storms that he shows, and then he shows the 46 years after that, 1970 to 2015. And yeah, there's no path that looks like what Matthew's going to do. And you can probably say that for a lot of storms because they tend to be in different spots. But it's still interesting. It's going to have a unique impact that no other major hurricane has had before.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the shape of the land where Florida meets Georgia, it's a curve. And with the storm on the track that it's taking, the water is just going to pile up in that area of northeast Florida and in the Georgia coast. It's quite remarkable, though, when you look at the last 46 years, and there's only been 3 tracks, 3 category 4 or 5 hurricanes that have hit the U.S. and none really look like the track that Matthew's going to take. So there's that, and then there's the fact that we haven't had the stat that goes back to 2005. Is that a major hurricane stat or a hurricane in general stat for the U.S.? I know Hermine broke that record. Major. So yeah, no major hurricane since 2005. A lot of people have said people in this part of Florida really don't know what it can be like, especially if you've just moved down there in the last number of years. So definitely a lot of concerns because of that, and the track is definitely a unique one there. Our final tweet is about GOES-R. So I don't know if you've heard, there's a fascinating new weather satellite that just about everyone I've met in the weather community is excited about. GOES-R is currently in the path of the storm. And this tweet comes from Alex Lammers. He's a meteorologist at NOAA. And his tweet says, for those wondering about the GOES-R satellite itself as it relates to Matthew, this was the official answer in today's Reddit AMA. I'm not hip enough to know what AMA is, but I know Reddit is quite a gathering place for people my age. If that's their thing, ask me anything. Okay. It says, it's a real answer. It says it's from NOAA.gov official account. It says, in advance of Hurricane Matthew's potential path to Florida's east coast, the team preparing NOAA's GOES-R spacecraft for launch has taken the appropriate safety measures to secure the satellite at its present location. It is at the Titusville, Florida aerospace or Astrotech Space Operations location. And it's in a building that apparently can withstand a strong, which they say is Category 4, hurricane conditions. After the effects of the storm subside, they're going to carefully assess the spacecraft and provide an update. So apparently the building is built to sustain a Category 4 storm. It's not very comforting when you're on the edge of that.
Yeah, wouldn't that be ironic if, a satellite was damaged by something that it was supposed to help lead the way in? Hopefully nothing bad happens. I'm
Googling Titusville, and for those that are unaware, like me, Titusville is right near Cape Canaveral. It's just more connected to the mainland of Florida. It's not out on that land that juts out into the ocean. It's more on the mainland, but still it's right in the path of Matthew. And if Matthew goes to the west, that'll place Titusville and Cape Canaveral in the worst portion of the storm, the northeast quadrant. So this is a very high stakes situation for a lot of equipment there at Cape Canaveral. Not just GOES-R, but I mean, we saw a rocket exploding there like a month ago. So there's definitely a lot of ongoing activity.
I took a quick look, and the latest high resolution rapid refresh, which is a short-term model that we use a lot, and it took it right over Cape Canaveral, the eye right over Cape Canaveral. So that's something definitely to watch for. Along with the human life and house property, gotta look out for our NASA property as well. Ian, what do you think about that kind of situation, sticky situation?
Yeah, no, it would be a nightmare on many levels. I mean, it's hard to spend too much time thinking about a satellite with, a whole bunch of people in danger, but it would be ironic. It would make an interesting story, I guess, but it does sound like they're pretty well hardened buildings there. So I would guess it'll probably end up okay. I mean, I know it's hard to get. I know even if you have 130, 140 mile per hour sustained, it's hard to measure that kind of wind in most places. So I guess you just got to keep your fingers crossed on that kind of thing.
So earlier on in the storm, we definitely had some confusion about the long-range progression once it left the southeast. I know some of the initial forecasts brought it right up close to New England. I'm glad that is not happening. What are your thoughts on some of the modeling earlier on from observations that you've had?
To me, I mean, it seems like they've had trouble outside a few days unless you're using ensembles. I know people have been pointing out that the Euro seems like it did pretty well at range, even like 7 to 10 days out. I don't know how much of that's real versus cherry picking. Sometimes I think it's probably still kind of silly to say a 10-day model did good or did well. If nothing else, that'll come back to bite us in the winter with people sharing snow maps and stuff. But I think there's tricky things in all of this, but it hasn't been that bad, I don't think.
I hate to talk about it as if it's in the past because it's not yet, but one thing that I definitely noticed, the Euro got somewhat of a black eye in the late stages of Hermine when all the ensembles clustered towards the New Jersey coast, and that didn't happen. But the one thing that struck me with the Euro is, and this has happened before, it seems like a lot of times the Euro will come up with a solution, not always at the same lead time, but it'll come up with a solution that makes you go, wow, like that doesn't make any sense. How could that be? Joaquin, you have a whole bunch of different examples. And that was what it did this time with the curve out to sea. Some people initially didn't believe it. And my thought was, well, you know what? That darn Euro usually leads the way when it comes up with what seems like an outrageous solution.
Nailed Sandy.
and Sandy. That's the other example. And I guess that's how it gets its reputation.
Yeah, I mean, they've pumped incredible resources into it. It's the competition between it and the US model and whatever is silly sometimes, but there's little doubt that long term the Euro is by far the best model we have out there. I mean, if you look out to about day 5, it's almost, I mean, there's situations where it's wrong, but it's right way more than it's wrong. And it seems to always nail the big storms.
The analogy I used the other day was it's just like the Patriots. Usually they win. Occasionally they have a little blunder.
Yeah, no, that's true. The Euro spins up a lot of huge storms that don't happen as well. So sometimes you wonder, like, maybe it just spins up so many huge storms that we remember the ones that it gets. But
well, it is. John Neese once said that it's the high stakes scenarios that matter. That's when it matters, and it seems to be.
No, that's true. We got a high stakes scenario on our hands now, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, so I guess let's talk about some of the impacts of Matthew. I'm looking at some of the prototype inundation potential storm surge by the National Hurricane Center, and it looks like they have the worst surge happening north of the Florida and Georgia border. Kind of right in southern Georgia and parts of northern Florida. And then many of you might not know, but storm surges is the number one killer on average when it comes to tropical systems. And then, of course, we have winds of over 100 miles an hour in a very, very small area of Matthew, and then even higher winds in a more localized area. I've seen some analogies to hurricane eye walls just being like a wedge tornado. Ian, you know tornadoes better than any of us here. What do you think of that analogy, and does it do anything to communicate the danger?
I know people are mixed on that one. I think probably partly because the winds in a hurricane are a little bit more pulsy maybe than in a tornado. Although I know there's little subvortices in both, and that all gets very tricky, but it's not a bad way to think about it. I mean, I posted one of the things I posted today when talking about Charlie was a video of the strongest part of Charlie, basically just ripping a gas station to shreds, and it's pretty incredible to watch. Back then, the National Weather Service actually issued tornado warnings for the eye wall of Charlie because it was so intense. And I think in retrospect, that kind of a warning is good because it sort of I mean, one, it triggers all the EAS broadcast information and gets, well, people still have power, but it gets noticed, it gets out there, that kind of thing. And if you take 100-mile gusts or 100-mile sustained with occasional gusts to 140 for like 10, 15, 20 minutes or even longer, sometimes it's going to cause some major problems. I mean, we saw in Andrew, some neighborhoods were basically flattened. I think it's kind of rare that we see a hurricane that really has that high level wind. I think they're more common in typhoons in the Pacific Ocean and stuff. I think around here, like you said, it's usually surge that people are worried about. So sometimes it's hard to really picture that the winds can just basically level stuff. And there's really nothing else that can do that beside a tornado. So I don't think it hurts to compare it, especially if that gets people to take action.
I really enjoyed the Charlie video you shared. I mean, it was pretty scary and terrifying, but it was definitely showed the sheer power of a storm like that. And so someone actually put themselves in that situation to be in the eye wall. You're a chaser. You chase tornadoes. Would you ever do a hurricane or a tropical storm chase?
I don't know. I'd like to see one once. I don't know. I think everybody into weather wants to see the high level of weather at least once. I mean, maybe not, but I think most people in weather like big weather, whether they're upfront about it or not. But I don't have any great interest in chasing hurricanes. I think one thing about chasing tornadoes is you can stay in control pretty well. I mean, there's a lot of people that get too close and bad things happen for whatever reason. But if you're conscious about things, you can, one, be fairly far away from the terrible winds, and two, have a quick exit. I think if you're trying to hit a hurricane in the perfect spot, you basically have to put yourself in mass peril for hours, and you at that point just hope that your preparations were right. I think if you end up in something like a parking garage on the 3rd floor or something, you'll probably be okay. But I know plenty of people who do it and are awesome at it and have still come closer than I think maybe they realized to very bad things happening. Not to mention the fact that you're inserting yourself into a giant disaster area, but that's a whole other debate.
Yeah. So forecast-wise, in the next 24 or 36 hours, do you have any predictions on whether or not the storm actually comes over land in Florida?
I haven't watched it all that closely this afternoon. I actually had to do some real work here and there. I know people have been saying it's trekking north a bit, but I know these things wobble. I don't know. In some ways, you almost have to hope it has some impact, just not because you want to see impact, just because there's been a whole lot of telling people to freak out. And it is a tight forecast. Sometimes people declare victory a little too early. I mean, you never know. It could.
You have to wait until it's over. There's
yeah.
Dakota, any predictions?
Not really. I'm not a forecaster by any means. I like doing it, but was never amazing at it. I don't know. I think at this point, to me, if I were in that position, the forecast, while important, isn't the most important to get people out of different areas.
The track itself, yeah.
Like I actually don't really like when people share just like it's a nitpicky Twitter police thing, but I don't like when people share just the line of a track. I don't think that does any justice to communicating what a hurricane is going to do. You just see a line and it's like, oh, that line is nowhere close to me, but tropical storm force winds and storm surge can be further out from the storm. And I think at this point the track's going to be important for local areas, but the overall message is get out of there if you're still there.
Yeah. I definitely agree with what you said about the line. Personally, I think the biggest, maybe some of the worst images that we'll see, probably Northeast Florida from the surge right along the coastline. My feeling with the wind is that in order to get the real big numbers, the storm would have to come ashore so that you get in the northeast, the east side. So but one thing is a guarantee, and that's the surge. I mean, I don't see any way that the surge doesn't happen. So unlike the wind, the surge is basically set in stone, and that's the reason why you evacuate. So if you're I'm looking at the Google map right now, St. Augustine is right along the water. I mean, if you're north of Daytona Beach along the coast, that's where the biggest threat probably is for the surge. And in the wind, certainly a threat, but as you said, Ian, it's not the same as a tornado. It's it's probably not going to flatten 60 miles of houses. It's different.
Right.
The surge is definitely the big concern. And Dakota, to add on to your point about the single line on the track, here in Connecticut, we were in the cone for a couple of updates. Wasn't very happy about it, but the one thing that I observe is as soon as we're in the cone, people start saying, "Oh my gosh, we're in the path of Matthew, and we're going to get hit." And I'm pulling my hair out. Like, no, we're not in the path of Matthew. We're in this day 5 cone of uncertainty. Like, so if you were to only show that single line, the track, that's a big problem. But then when you show the cone, I think it's when you hear what these people say, it's a testament to what it means. When people see that cone, they think they're going to get hit. So if you don't include the cone, maybe the wrong message is sent. The cone is definitely important, though. And
I have a rant here.
Yeah.
So a news, I don't know, online news company in New York City. You guys probably saw it.
An online news company.
I'm not going to say who they
are. A glorified blogging website. Okay, keep going.
I don't know much about them, but
I'm not even sure I know who it is now. I have to look this up.
Well, that's good. They had a post that said New York City, Hurricane Matthew could hit New York City in like the next week or something like that. That was the headline, and then it went on to say how it's how it was a Cat 5 and how it's could bring devastating impacts. And people see that, they think Sandy, they think subways flooded, and oh my gosh, this is going to happen. Obviously there wasn't that mass panic, but I'm sure a few people reacted poorly to it just because there was the idea that this big hurricane could come and slam into New York City. So I emailed the writer. I really wanted to tweet, and
you have a lot of time.
Yeah, well, I got so pissed about it that I was like, I need to say something. And I sent him an email, and I asked, I had one question, and I said, why? And that's all I said. And he responded. He was actually very nice. He responded and said, well, is it not a possibility that Matthew could hit New York City? And then I went down the list and explained to him, what meteorologists are actually trying to do and blah, blah, blah. And he actually included what I said in his post. He updated it and put my kind of segment in there. And so that was pretty cool, but still, it was really bad that he even wrote it in the first place. So,
yeah, I mean, there's obviously been a proliferation of weather sources in the last decade, and far too often you have garbage that's being put out there. And I wonder sometimes what it does to people's responsiveness, because I think we have a superior filter. We can look at something in half a second. We know if it's good or if it's bad. I don't think the everyday person can do that when they see it flash across on their Facebook feed.
I mean, especially when there's a cone that shows that. I mean, he had valid stuff in there, and a lot of times they do have valid information. It just they sensationalize it so much. Ian, I'm sure you have a comment.
Well, no, I mean, I agree that there's just so many more people doing it now than there were. It's harder to get notice. And then at the same time, I think people that aren't that well versed have realized that weather gets a lot of interest, so they want to jump in on it. So I think some of it is unintentional. It seemed like this guy probably at least partly listened to your concerns, so that's a good thing. But in general, overall, I think you're seeing the whole field sort of pushed more and more toward I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way of saying it. I think at least push more toward making everything somewhat interesting. So I think there is a valid concern that, people will have trouble differentiating the real big thing versus the we wanted this to look like a big thing, so you'd look at it. But
Absolutely. I deal with that all the time. If I, like if something as simple as a weekend forecast, if we've been concerned about some heavy rain for a while and we finally are confident it's not going to happen, I'm not going to put a clickbait headline out there. I'm going to put what the truth is and that it's going to be a beautiful weekend. I mean, you got to tell the truth at some point when it's the truth.
right.
So often I find people that are trying to like squirm around the truth so they can write a clickable headline.
No, that's true. And I think in some degrees, we've seen that even with this storm, especially back when it was in the Caribbean. If nothing else, there were a lot of really big headlines about Jamaica seeing the worst storm it's ever seen, and then the storm missed Jamaica. So it does seem that I know some of the early forecasts were close to Jamaica, so there should have been concern, but sometimes it does feel like people are chasing a story rather than, sharing the forecast as it's supposed to be.
The one great ability that meteorologists have is to look into the future. And most of us know that there will be plenty of instances when there is a dire situation. You don't need to make every little rain shower or every little whatever it is, every little storm or snow or inch of snow a dire situation. We have the ability to know that, even though it may have been quiet the last 3 months, there will be storms that come along in the future. And we need to reserve our highest warning flag for those situations. And I think sometimes other people need to realize that.
No, for sure. And I think,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think in a lot of ways, the social media and all the lead up into this hasn't been quite as bad as people feared. I think once we've come to a recognition that this is actually the real deal, I think people sort of take it fairly seriously. The true hype at this point is pretty minimal, I would think.
Yeah, so we've been following Matthew for a long time. What, I don't know, a week and a half ago?
Years.
2 weeks ago? Yeah. How much, I know it's good to be monitoring storms out there. The National Hurricane Center has to do it so we can keep track of it, but I don't see like the positive to 10 days out telling people along any sort of coast that there's a storm out there. I don't know, prepare. It seems like 10 days out there's not really much more you can do compared to 4 days out, and 10 days out you're going to have a lot of cry wolf scenarios where that storm never really does anything. And we kind of with Hermine that kind of happened.
I think
as well. We were bored. Meteorologists were bored, and they needed something to chat about.
I think that's true. Hermine was a good example. I mean, you could have cut a week out of the Hermine tracking, and the public would have been just as well off.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think especially we've had some quiet hurricane seasons lately, but that's not going to last forever, especially with the oceans on fire and all that kind of stuff. So you could have, if you went back to like a bigger type of season, you could basically be tracking showers somewhere in the Atlantic for 3 or 4 months straight, and quite a few of them would end up not doing anything or missing the U.S. or whatnot.
Yeah, so we'll continue to monitor Matthew, as I'm sure you will. Most of our listeners are weather savvy and probably updating National Hurricane Center and various satellite imagery. So if you're listening and you're on the coast, evacuate if you're in a voluntary or mandatory evacuation area.
Looks like it's about to get hairier on the coast. That new eye wall is getting close to the coast, so it's about to start going downhill in a lot of places, especially like West Palm Beach and north.
Yeah, we were looking at a 1 to 3 a.m. Eastern time landfall, I think. So
yeah, it looks like it's wobbling back toward the coast now. So it's definitely going to start getting ugly in some of those places.
Yeah, so hope for the best, and I hope people have taken precautions. Ian, I wanted to give you one last chance. You have any sort of rant that you wanted to go? It was supposed to be your open mic night, but Matthew hijacked that.
No, I think tonight's a good night to skip the rants, I would say. I'll plug something I wrote with Brendan Heberton of Weather 5280, which is one of your Dakota, one of your local hometown blogs, sort of out from Denver. We sort of, I don't know, we had joked a lot back and forth. And so I guess maybe this is a partial rant. We joked back and forth a lot how silly it was. Everybody always mentions that there was no Twitter and no iPhone. Last time there was a major hurricane, like that's a great revelation. But we decided that we would put together a list of all the things that weren't around during the last hurricane, and it actually came out kind of interesting. We put together seven different sort of main topics of things that weren't around. And I think we complain about Twitter, we complain about being connected to iPhones all the time, but a lot of this new technology and things like drones and just the proliferation of great visual websites, I think this kind of stuff is going to help a lot of people. It helps them in the lead up to a hurricane, and it'll help in the recovery process after. So, I think in some ways we look at these things just nonstop in a dire fashion and how horrible it is. But I think in a lot of ways we should be thankful how far we've come. A lot fewer people are going to get killed or injured in a storm like this than would have happened in the past. So we should thank the meteorological community and all the hardworking folks out there for the continued advances.
And every week we ask our guest for some advice for someone who may be considering studying meteorology, or someone that is already studying meteorology and maybe getting caught up in some of the calculus. Now, we know that you did not study meteorology, but you have an interesting perspective. What type of advice, what type of encouragement would you give those people?
I don't know. I'm not sure you want to hear my answer, because I was afraid. I was afraid of calculus, and that's probably the main reason that I'm not a meteorologist. But I know plenty of people that hate math that made it, and I think I probably could have too if I would have really given it a go. I think in the end, it ended up I was in Connecticut, and I wanted to be near home, and so I just didn't chase that career. But I would just say, I mean, if you're into weather, go for it. There's more opportunities today than there's ever been, I think, and that'll continue to grow, especially if you diversify your interests and learn a programming language or learn GIS or learn communications. There's lots of opportunities out there. And I think in the near future, more and more companies are going to start realizing that it would be good to have a staff meteorologist and all that kind of stuff. So I know one big concern, and a concern of mine back in the day, was just that there's not a ton of jobs for how many people there are, but I think the job market has been getting better in that field, and it'll continue to get better. I mean, I think geeks and nerds and everything with big data and all this stuff, it's sort of the era of the geek. So if you're a meteorologist, not to say you guys are geeks, but I guess some of you wear that badge proudly. There's a whole show called The Weather Geeks. So just go for it, I think.
It's the era of the geeks. Great advice, Ian. And before we sign off here, we had two questions, and I wanted to answer them real quick just because we solicited for them. This first one comes from Joe Cody. He says, Matthew is an historic storm. What about Florida/Atlantic geography and patterns have prevented a major cane from hitting these areas? Does anyone have a solid answer for this?
To me, it seems like it's kind of random. I mean, I think when you get to category 5 or 4 or 5 landfalls, even major hurricane landfalls, they're not really frequent anywhere. I think a category 4 or 5 is basically unprecedented in any one spot. There might be 1 or 2 spots that have been hit by 2, but I think it's random. I mean, one, I guess it's hard to get a storm to just keep going in that general angle, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's any specific reason they've been missed.
Yeah, if you go back to look at that tweet from Philip Klotzbach that we had up, a lot of the Cat 4, Cat 5 tracks were different, and very few of them overlap. So I think Ian's right on that. It's kind of random when it comes to these powerful hurricanes. Thanks, Cody, for that question. And the final question, it's a rhetorical question. It's from Phil Johnson over at Stormfront Freaks. Why was Matthew able to become Cat 5 hurricane and Ian only made it to tropical storm status? Ian, what was going on?
I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. But at the same time, like I've heard from people like Dennis. I've known Dennis forever, and I'm still gonna butcher his last name, Macero. Dennis, is that how you say it? I don't know.
Mercero, I think.
Mercero. He always likes to say how after Hurricane Dennis hit, people didn't like him anymore. So I don't know if I want to go through that. Plus, at the same time, I know eventually an ice storm will be great. I use great in the weather lover term. But I know over history, I think there's more retired storm names that start with an I letter than any other name. So I guess I'll just have to wait for 6 more years for my chance.
Yeah, well, I think that was a low blow, Phil. Low blow.
Yeah, it's not too surprising from Phil, but we'll get him back at some point.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Ian, for joining us. Really appreciate it, and we'll be sure to have you on again sometime soon.
Cool. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's great to be part of your conversation.
All right, we'll continue to track Matthew, but that does it for this week's edition of the Weather Junkies. As always, you can catch us right here on YouTube, but also on our multiple podcast platforms. We have them all on our website. And we hope that you'll join us right back here next week.
I am El Nino.